Donald Trump is weaponizing the Department of Justice to target his political opponents. Yet too many people, including some Democrats, are falling into his dangerous trap. I don't like John Bolton any more than you. But by letting Donald Trump pick and choose about who gets prosecuted, we risk normalizing authoritarian behavior. In this video, I explain why we all must stand up against Trump's plan and avoid being manipulated into thinking that his vindictive and selective prosecutions have legitimacy. But before we get into it, subscribe to this channel to stay informed about how you can defend democracy. Donald Trump is using the Department of Justice to go after his political enemies. I think everybody agrees on that. In fact, even Donald Trump agrees with that. He has made clear that in this term of office, he is going to use every lever of government, to pursue his enemies for revenge, to pursue his enemies, in my view, for political advantage. And I believe to pursue his political opponents and opposition figures in order to hold power and to prevent him from losing power in 2026 and perhaps even in 2028. Now, having said that, there then has become some disagreement among people on the left, among people who are Democrats, who are progressives, who are liberals, who all fundamentally agree that Donald Trump is a threat to the rule of law, who agree that Donald Trump is misusing the Department of Justice, who agree that Donald Trump is going after his political enemies, but who disagree on some really, really important points about what the contours of that are and what, more importantly, the signposts are that we should be reading about whether something that is happening is a political act or an act in good faith on behalf of federal prosecutors. Okay, now let me lay out my case from the beginning and my perspective, and then I'm going to sort of walk through this. I believe that Donald Trump has completely corrupted the Department of Justice from top to bottom. Pam Bondi is the Attorney General because she is a Donald Trump sycophant. She will do whatever he wants. She has purged the Department of Justice of senior leadership, of anyone who will stand up to her and defend the rule of law against Donald Trump. And that purging has gone much further down than people recognize. And unfortunately, much further down than people who used to be federal prosecutors are prepared to admit. They have a nostalgia. They have a commitment to what the Department of Justice is in their mind. In my mind, that Department of Justice, if it ever existed, it is gone. That is not the reality today. And therefore, we need to assume that any prosecution today is subject to political pressure from the White House, and that it has no internal guardrails to protect the innocent and to protect Donald Trump's adversaries from the arbitrary and misuse of government power. So that's my view. It is a maximalist view that basically says there is nothing the Department of Justice does now that should not be second guessed. Now, on the other end of the spectrum of people who I respect and who are operating in good faith, they say, look, the senior echelons of the Department of Justice may be corrupted, but that doesn't mean that every U.S. attorney has been. And it doesn't mean that every line prosecutor has been. And therefore, we can judge between and among people who are being prosecuted who appear to be Donald Trump's enemies based on these signposts, these guideposts by these career prosecutors. And so in this video, I'm going to discuss a lot of that and much, much more about doctrinally what we should be concerned about, what protections are in place and what protections are not in place. But I wanted to lay that out up front because it's going to help you make sense of the disagreements that are going on right now among liberals and progressives and Democrats. And so by the end of this video, I hope you will agree with me that we need to be on a much more skeptical footing when it comes to any prosecution or investigation conducted by people who report to Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, and ultimately, and this is the key, ultimately to Donald Trump. So let's jump into this and talk about a few examples. So there is widespread agreement that the prosecutions of some individuals, James Comey, Tish James are good examples, are purely political. All of us from center left to left, from Democrat to independent, from former prosecutors to people like me who have never been prosecutors, everyone in the pro-democracy community seems to agree that those cases are entirely without merit. Where this gets trickier is when we start to get to some of the other cases. For example, I have long been advocating that the prosecution of Congresswoman MacIver, LaMonica MacIver in New Jersey, is an example of a political prosecution. As just to remind all of you, she is a Democratic member of Congress from Newark, New Jersey, who did an oversight visit of an ICE facility and was indicted because, according to Alina Habba, one of the president's lawyers, who was the acting U.S. attorney there. That's a whole other question whether or not she was properly the acting U.S. attorney. Federal judges have said she wasn't. But according to her, MacIver was involved in something of a scuffle. I'm going to leave it to you to go look at the videotapes and judge it for yourself. It doesn't look to me like the Congresswoman did anything. But what's clear to me, as plain as day, is that the only reason why LaMonica MacIver got indicted is because Donald Trump wanted to go after a Democratic member of Congress, particularly a black woman, let's be honest, Democratic member of Congress from Newark, New Jersey, who was a pain in his ass, who was doing something that she's entitled to do by federal law, explicitly in federal law. And so he wanted to make an example. And so Alina Habba wanted to make an example. Pam Bondi wanted to make an example. Kash Patel wanted to make an example. And by the way, it may not even be that Donald Trump ordered this one up, but he doesn't have to, because the people below him know what is going to please him. And that's the problem that I have with saying we're going to rely on the good faith of any federal prosecutors. Because if you're at this point a government lawyer, whether you're a federal prosecutor or a lawyer in the civil division of the Department of Justice, or you're working in housing and urban development, or you're working in the Commerce Department, it doesn't matter. At this point, 10 months into Donald Trump's administration, if you're working in the federal government as a lawyer, you know what the president wants. You know what your supervisor's supervisor wants, even if your supervisor doesn't say it out loud. And you know what will help you keep your job, and you know what may help you get fired. And so, look, I have called upon federal prosecutors to leave their jobs. I have said that if you're in, for example, the Eastern District of Virginia, which is the office that prosecuted the cases against Comey and against Tish James, that if you're a career prosecutor, you should resign. But I've also been told by, again, some of the people on the left, some of the people who are liberals, people who are Democrats, people of good faith who I am disagreeing with but not accusing of anything, that it's not so simple for them to leave because they have mortgages, they have families, they have bills to pay, they have student loans to pay, and the job market for these lawyers may be quite limited right now. So my rejoinder to that is, if that's the case, then we cannot trust them to be the centuries of democracy, right? Because they're trying to keep their jobs. By definition, under that scenario, they're trying to keep their jobs. And therefore, they are going to advocate things that are wrong. They're going to do and say things that are despicable. And even if we don't hold them personally accountable for that, they are certainly not someone we're going to look to tell us whether something is or is not a political prosecution. So, MacIver is one of these instances where I have felt, frankly, that too many commentators on the left have, frankly, either abandoned that case or simply ignored it. One step worse than that has been the John Bolton case. So John Bolton was the national security advisor under Donald Trump in his first term. I do not like John Bolton. I suspect many of you don't like John Bolton. By the way, I also don't like James Comey. I think he actually was responsible for costing Hillary Clinton the election in 2016. But in any event, John Bolton is a Donald Trump enemy. Donald Trump has said that he hates John Bolton and has indicated that he wants to go after him. So when John Bolton gets his house raided and then gets indicted, my presumption, my jumping off point is that this is not on the up and up, that this is the political misuse of the Department of Justice. And unfortunately, from my perspective, and surprisingly in some quarters, there have been a lot of people on the left who have said, no, look, there is more to this case than there were to the Tish James case and the case involving James Comey. There's more substance to it. The investigation began under under Joe Biden. And when you read the indictment, there seems to be more substance there. And by the way, this case was brought by career prosecutors. That's why I started by talking about the role of career prosecutors. Because the question is, what weight do you put on that? You know, I was on set actually with Nicole Wallace when the Tish James indictment came down. And a lot of the people on that set and, on the air were quick to try to figure out whether Lindsay Halligan, the Trump placed appointed lawyer, was the only one who appeared in the grand jury or signed the indictment, or whether there was a career prosecutor. And I made the point loud and clear before we knew. It didn't matter to me. Like the presence of a career prosecutor isn't going to change the fact that Tish James is the victim of a political hit job, of an abuse of the Department of Justice, and that her indictment should be dismissed. I'm not giving that power to some lawyer who works for Pam Bondi. I mean, why on earth would I do that? But, that kind of mooted itself because there were no career prosecutors, apparently, who signed that indictment or in that grand jury room. Or if there were, they weren't from the Eastern District of Virginia. But again, that wasn't a relevant fact to me. But this flared up around John Bolton because it was a relevant factor to a lot of people who have said, look, the Bolton case is different. In fact, there was an article recently that was titled something like, "The Bolton case is not like the others." And my rejoinder is, it is exactly like the others, as is the MacGyver case. Okay? These are all the same in the critical operative fact, which is that Donald Trump is using the power of the federal government to prosecute his political enemies. And like I said, even if he's not doing it directly. Now, we know from the fact that one of his social media posts was supposed to be a private direct message to the Attorney General and made public. We know at least with a couple of these folks that it was at the president's direction. And who the hell knows? Does anyone really think, by the way, that that was the only time Donald Trump ever sent a direct message telling Pam Bondi, Pam, who to go after? If so, I got a bridge to sell you. Okay, but even if he didn't, like I said, the system is structurally set up now to please him. And so these are, from my standpoint, all the same. They are all efforts to use the Department of Justice to go after his political enemies. Now, part of the reason why I think there is this disconnect between my position and the position of some of the legal analysts, like I said, is background. I've never been a federal prosecutor. I never worked in a U.S. Attorney's office. I never worked for the government at all as an employee. And most of the people who are taking the other side of this, they are clinging to Department of Justice norms and rules. Well, I'm here to say those norms and rules don't exist anymore. And we just got to get over that. Like people who are going on TV or writing columns or posting on social media that the Department of Justice does not do X, Y, and Z. I am here to tell you the Department of Justice is doing X, Y, and Z. When they say that federal prosecutors, have a standard of conduct that does not allow them to indict people if they don't believe that they are in fact guilty. I mean, that may have been true. I'm going to just take them at their word. That was true until approximately 12:01 p.m. on January 20th, 2025. After that, that was no longer true. And every day brings more evidence that it is not true now, and it is not going to be true a year from now, and it is not going to be true 2 years from now, and it's not going to be true in 2028. And honestly, it may never be true again. I mean, I've talked about the need to rebuild a new opposition movement with a new jurisprudence and a new way of thinking about government. You can go look at the other videos that I've posted about exactly that. But we can defer for another time about what it would look like in the future, what a Department of Justice should look like and will look like in the future. But for between now and the time Donald Trump leaves office, at least for that period of time, it is not true that there are these norms. It is not true that federal prosecutors don't do this and don't do that. The ones who don't do this and don't do that may have already resigned. I give a lot of credit to Hagen Skoten, line assistant in New York, who resigned because he said that he wouldn't do the things that were wrong. And he wrote this letter and said, and this is the critical part, he told Emile Beauvais that he would find a fool and a coward to do the wrong thing, but that it wasn't going to be him. Everyone focused on the part of that was the resignation. I focus on the fact that here is this very bright conservative young lawyer, a conservative's conservative. And I don't just focus on the fact that he did the right thing and resigned, but I focus on the fact that he pointed out that Emil Bovee, now a federal judge, but at that time at the Department of Justice, would find a fool or a coward to do the wrong thing. Now, look, I'm not saying every line prosecutor, every lawyer in the Department of Justice is that fool or coward, but a lot of them are. And it's impossible for us to know which are which. It's impossible for those of us on the outside to know whether the line prosecutor who's bringing a case really would have brought it anyway, or is just a fool or a coward who's trying to keep their job, trying to pay their mortgage, looking for a job but not yet able to leave. And so my view is we need to be skeptical of all of it. Now, I want to say that this is not just a policy debate. This is also based on the law. So one of the reasons why I disagree with the perspective that so many former prosecutors have taken and legal commentators on the left have taken towards Bolton and other cases like that is that they look to the underlying merits of the case. And first of all, like, you have to understand, the indictment, that's one side of the story. That is an incomplete one side of the story. That is just what the prosecutors got a grand jury to agree to based on the limited evidence they were presented. And anyone who reads an indictment and thinks there's a lot of substance there, they're just reading the government's cherry-picked version of events. So I think that's problematic to begin with. But in any event, even if that's true, even if the indictment somehow were a fair-minded presentation of the facts, which again, it's not, we're skipping over the law of vindictive prosecution and selective prosecution, right? I mean, think about it this way. If someone conducts an illegal search in your house, they break down your door and they conduct a legal search and they find some drugs in your dresser, everybody knows that those are going to be suppressed and any indictment is going to be dismissed because they violated your constitutional rights. Well, vindictive prosecution as a doctrine exists to protect people's constitutional rights. You never get to the question of the underlying facts if, in fact, it is a vindictive prosecution. The same is true with selective prosecution. Now, these are two different doctrines. I'm not going to bother you with all of the nits and jots, but what you need to know is that most of what I'm focused on is vindictive prosecution, right? The idea that the motivation behind this is to punish people for exercising their constitutional rights of standing up and speaking out against Donald Trump. That's really what's going on. It's not that there are 27 former national security advisors, and they're only picking one of them. Now, MacGyver's got an interesting claim for both, not just vindictive prosecution, but selective prosecution. She actually has a very interesting claim of selective prosecution. But so I want to mention both of them. But really what is motivating me in my analysis of all of this is the idea that Donald Trump is using the Department of Justice to go after his political enemies. And that is really speaks in vindictive prosecution more than selective prosecution. So one of the reasons why I object so strenuously to the focus of so much of the commentary in these cases, even in the Tish James case, even in the James Comey case, a lot of the commentary was about, well, here are the forms that were filled out by Tish James, and here's the reason why, in fact, there's not there, and this was the de minimis amount of money at stake. Like, I don't want to get into any of that. Tish James should not have been indicted because it's a vindictive act by the President of the United States, misusing the power of the federal government, the awesome power of the Department of Justice, which can take away people's liberty interests, put them in prison for political purposes. End of story. I don't need to get into the facts. I don't need to know anything more than what I just said to you, and neither should you. And frankly, no one on the left, no one who has considered themselves to be a civil libertarian should need to hear more. No one who is trying to stand up as part of the pro-democracy movement can afford to have the media and the commentariat focus on the underlying facts. There is a saying that is attributed to Joseph Stalin's head of internal police. Show me the man and I'll show you the crime. Now, this is a very important concept because what he was saying there is not that there is no crime. He wasn't saying we're going to make up a crime. He wasn't saying we're going to plant evidence of a crime. What he's saying is that no one has lived a perfect life. No one has lived such a perfect life that a prosecutor, an investigative agency with unlimited resources and unlimited power, could not find something, however small, and decide to use that as the pretext to prosecute, indict, try to convict, try to ruin, drag through the mud political enemies. That's what Stalin's Russia did. Sure, sometimes it was just making things up, but as often as not, the autocrats are not entirely making them up. I mean, Vladimir Putin consolidated power by going after oligarchs who opposed him. These oligarchs were not innocent men. These were not people who had lived the Boy Scout life. They had, in fact, been engaged in a lot of the conduct that they were accused by Vladimir Putin of being engaged in. But he weaponized it intentionally against his opponents and not against his friends. Sounds a little like vindictive prosecution, a little like selective prosecution. Again, the concepts are what matter here. The legal concepts matter, but the broader political and theoretical and democracy concepts matter, which is that we cannot say that any opposition leader of Donald Trump's can be indicted or investigated or smeared or ruined because a FBI with unlimited resources and motivation to please Trump, that if they find something, that there will be liberal commentators who will say, well, I read the indictment and there looks like there was something there. I mean, that's just, I'm just telling you, that's dangerous. That is going to be the end of the pro-democracy movement. We are only 10 months in and we've already started to see rolling out these criminal prosecutions. So there is a related concept, and I'm going to have more to say about this in future videos. But by the way, if you enjoy this video, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. You know, I try to make these useful for you, and I read the comments. So if there is something I'm covering or not covering, or you have a question, just put it in the comments right now. It would do a world of good for me to be able to see how to make these more effective. And while you're at it, also, if you like the video, hit the like button. If you're not already subscribed, hit the subscribe button. Okay, that related concept, though, is the idea of the difference between the rule of law and the rule by law. Now, in the United States, we have rule of law. What does that mean? It means we have laws. People are bound to follow the law, and that justice is blind. The law is supposed to apply to everyone equally. If no one is being prosecuted for simple possession of marijuana, then no one is prosecuted. Not only some people, but not others. Right? That's rule of law. If there is no crime against something, then there's no crime against it. If people drive 56 miles an hour on a 55 mile an hour highway, no one gets pulled over. If everyone drives 55 and under, then people who do drive over 55 can be pulled over, right? The idea is that the law applies to everyone, regardless of their station in life, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their political affiliation. Now, before you say anything, I know that we fail as a country too often in applying the rule of law, right? We know there's unequal treatment of the law, but that's at least the theoretical underpinning of our system that we strive for, that the Department of Justice thinks it is trying to do. But there's a different concept. And this is a concept that comes out of authoritarianism, comes out of authoritarian regimes, and it is quickly seeping into the language and the actions of this administration. And we cannot let that happen without calling it out. And that is rule by law. Now, what does that mean? That means that people don't stand equally before the bar of justice, that the law is to be used by the rulers as a way to punish enemies and reward friends. So now everyone's driving 56 miles an hour on the highway, and the police are told just pick out the Democrats. Not the Republicans, just the Democrats. give just Democrats citations at 56 miles an hour. Now, why do I use that example? Because like 56 miles an hour, if you're in a 55-mile-an-hour zone, you are speeding. Like, you have violated the law. This is why I say we can't go to the underlying merits, because in that instance, you're speeding. The underlying merits is, yeah, you were speeding. You were going a mile over the speed limit. But rule by law is what's happening. It's selective. It's vindictive. It's using the law to punish enemies and reward friends, right? 56 miles an hour, good example of punishing enemies. But you could imagine all the way in which laws can also be used to reward friends in the granting of government contracts. You know, maybe you change the editorial stance of your newspaper. Just saying, could be. Maybe you want a media merger, and so you fire some people or you suspend some people. Just saying, right? That's rule by law. And so we can't disconnect selective prosecution, vindictive prosecution, the weaponization of government from this underlying theoretical construct, because that is the construct that Donald Trump is trying to get us all used to. Like, Donald Trump actually regularly posts on social media and says in speeches the things that are consistent with rule by law, right? George Santos. Why did George Santos get a pardon? What did Donald Trump say? Well, because he voted Republican. That is rule by law. Right there. That's rule by law. Right? Law says he can get pardons, but he's going to dispense them. He's going to use the law, not have everyone upheld under a single standard under the law. There is a very important court-made doctrine that I have written about, I've spoken about, I've done videos, I've been on TV about. I will be talking about this every day until Donald Trump leaves office or until the courts finally line themselves up on the right side. That plays into all of these concepts. It is referred to as the presumption of regularity. It is the idea that if a federal prosecutor, or that matter, any federal lawyer says, we did this thing for this reason, that judges are to say, okay, that's probably the reason they did it. It is the idea that we take the government at its word. We assume good faith. We assume that if the president says there is a violent insurrection in Portland, there's actually a violent insurrection in Portland and not a bunch of people dressed up as frogs and unicorns. It's actually a very useful concept in a normal government, right? You got a federal government that's all over the place, bringing lots of criminal cases, lots of civil cases, constantly being sued. And so what developed was this doctrine that says, look, when lawyers from the Department of Justice stand up in court and say a fact is a fact, we start with the presumption that that's true. And when they say they are going to do something or didn't do something or may do something, that what they're telling the court is true. We are going to lose our country. We're going to lose our democracy if courts continue to abide by the presumption of regularity, period. I can't put it any plainer. Okay. It is the court equivalent of the legal commentator saying, well, there was a career prosecutor on the pleading, so it must be good faith. Right? The court equivalent of that is that the judges, when they get these indictments or the government files a motion, the judges say, well, it must be on the up and up. Donald Trump's regime should not be given the benefit of the doubt on anything. They have forfeited that. They have already constantly lied to federal judges. They have already proven themselves willing to misuse the full power of the federal government to go after their political enemies. They have disregarded federal laws. They have disregarded constitutional rights. They have made misrepresentation after misrepresentation to federal judge after federal judge. We need to, for God's sake, stop giving them the benefit of the doubt in court. The first thing I've been talking about is the commentariat not giving the benefit of the doubt, the legacy media not giving the benefit of the doubt, you all as citizens not giving the benefit of the doubt, but boy, the federal courts need to stop giving the benefit of the doubt as well. In some respects, that is the most important thing, because every time some lawyer for Pam Bondi, and let's just be honest, again, that's who they are Pam Bondi's lawyers, stand up in a courtroom someplace and say, this defendant is dangerous. This indictment is genuine. This person is a threat to the safety of the United States. That person has not yet been sent to a gulag abroad. Every time they do that and they lie, shame on us for giving them another chance. And we know that they are not telling the truth. in record numbers. And so we need to end this presumption of regularity. Now, for the lawyers out there, I want to offer you like a legal reason. It's made up. There is nothing in the Constitution that says the government should get a presumption of regularity. In fact, the entire Bill of Rights is a restriction on government power. How the hell could you read the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Third Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the Seventh, the Eighth? How can you read any of those and walk away with the idea that there is a presumption that the government is acting in good faith? These are all restrictions on government power because the founders understood that the government can't be trusted. The government needs to be limited. We need a constitution that begins with Congress shall make no law. Congress shall make no law, because we don't trust that if they make laws, they won't oppress individual rights, right? So the presumption of regularity is just a made-up court doctrine that really came out of the New Deal when there were a lot of things going on and the courts just needed a way to let the administrative state develop. And over time, it has blossomed and it has gotten bigger and it's gotten more extensive and it applies in more areas. And it is time to put an end to it. It is at odds with originalism. It is at odds with textualism. It is at odds. There's no federal law that says that there's a presumption of regularity. If Congress wants to give a presumption of regularity, let them pass a fucking law, but they haven't. So courts need to abolish this. That is true whether the statements are made by Pam Bondi or Donald Trump, or they're made by a career prosecutor who's been in the department for 25 years. I'm sorry, but all of them have forfeited the right to be believed, because they all eventually work for Donald Trump, who claims a unitary executive where everyone in the executive branch answers to him. They all work for Pam Bondi, the attorney general, who is a sycophant of Donald Trump's. They are all relying, or most of them are relying in criminal cases, on an FBI run by Kash Patel. Democracy cannot afford to have us continue to wring our hands every time someone gets indicted and every time it's leaked to the press that someone is under criminal prosecution, that we have to seem fair-minded. We want to seem balanced. We want to give the government the benefit of the doubt. I'm sorry, the presumption of innocence, well, that is in the Constitution. That goes back to common law, pre-Constitution. What about the presumption of innocence would mean we should ever give a benefit of doubt to a federal prosecutor? And so we need a better approach. And like I said, I recognize that there are a lot of good people, a lot of really well-meaning pro-democracy advocates who disagree with me on this. But I would suggest they disagree with me not because of lived experience with Donald Trump's administration, but because of their lived experiences under prior administrations. So it may be that when George Bush was president and you were in a U.S. attorney's office and you had personal convictions that leaned to the left, you could do your job without fear or favor. It may be that if you were under Barack Obama or Joe Biden's administration, you felt that you were not being meddled with by a White House of your own party. It might even be that in the first Trump administration, you felt the ability to do what you thought was right. But that's not the case anymore. Donald Trump has ripped that rule book up, and we need to mourn it, but we need to let it go. It's not coming back. I'm not sure it's ever coming back, but it's not coming back under Donald Trump. And every day that goes by, more and more damage is done in the name of career prosecutors, in the name of, I read the indictment and it looks like it's real to me, in the name of the investigation was opened under Joe Biden. Well, it's interesting. The Bolton investigation opened under Joe Biden wasn't indicted under Joe Biden. What does that tell you? Right? All those career prosecutors, they could have brought the case under Joe Biden. They didn't. So it feels a little bit like what we're doing here is we're grading on a curve. We're grading on a curve because people who served in the Department of Justice want to believe in the goodness of the Department of Justice. And listen to this, because many of them and almost everyone in the legacy media is invested in a little bit of both sides. Some of the indictments by Pam Bondi's Department of Justice are political, and some of them are political-ish, but if you squint real hard, they look okay to us. don't move the goalposts. Don't grade on a curve. Don't find a way to bless or excuse the evil and the inexcusable. They don't deserve that benefit of the doubt. The defendants deserve your doubt. They deserve your grace. They deserve your skepticism. And as we head towards more and more cases against more and more people, more and more instances where they will find the man, more and more cases in which Donald Trump will identify the man and they will find the crime. We need to say no from the beginning, not later when we find out we were wrong. By then, the damage is done. So the first thing we need to do is we need to be skeptical, deeply skeptical whenever you hear a case has been indicted against someone who is an opposition figure, a Democrat, a critic of the Trump administration, anyone in that genre. Anytime that comes up, we need to start with a position of deep skepticism. I'm not saying it can't be overcome. I mean, I'm not saying like, that's a get out of jail free card for anyone who opposed Donald Trump. I'm just saying, let's start with deep-seated skepticism. The second thing we need to do is we need to focus on the potential bad motives before we get to the facts. Now, what do I mean by that? When we hear word that there's a new indictment, don't read the indictment. Don't talk about the facts of the indictment. Ignore those, set those aside. Go look at the videos of me on with Nicole Wallace for 2 hours when Tish James was indicted. I was on for 2 hours. I did not utter a single peep about what was in the indictment. In fact, while others we got copies on the set and others were underlining and making notes, I didn't want a copy. I didn't need it. There was nothing that was going to be in that document that was going to change the underlying reality that Tish James was being prosecuted for political motives, period. I don't need more than that. And neither should the legacy media, neither should you, neither should the commentators. We should center the coverage on the motives. Why is this person being prosecuted? Are they being prosecuted because they're an opponent of Donald Trump's or some other reason? Why have all these Republicans been pardoned? Why is Tom Homan not being prosecuted, even though he had a bag, according to the media, of $50,000 of cash handed to him? If you can see that side of it, then you can also see the side I'm talking about. And I am more worried about them indicting people who are opposing Donald Trump than they are that they're letting off George Santos. I'm outraged by both. Don't get me wrong. I'm outraged by both. But the second is more dangerous. Maybe it's just the old civil libertarian in me, that you'd rather have 10 guilty people go free than one innocent person convicted. That has to be our attitude. We need to not search for the guilt in these people. We need to center ourselves on the likelihood of their innocence and that they are victims. Because if we don't do that, Donald Trump is going to wear us down. There will always be that fool or that coward that Hagen Skoton warned us about. The career prosecutor who is willing to sign the document, file the complaint, argue the motion, or return the indictment. That is wrong. I do these videos because I'm trying to help you make sense of a very, very complicated world. And there is no topic more complicated than this one, because like I said, you have people within the community on the left, within legal analysts of good faith, who have differing perspectives here. I want to thank you for hearing me out on this. And I want you to think about what I said. I want you to think about what other people said too. And then what I want you to do is to leave a comment and let me know what you thought about this video. And I also would ask you, if you find these videos useful, please hit the subscribe button, because that will help support this channel.